is, of course, what money's doing. We all want more of it. We all want more money, folks, but the money we've got and the money we're earning is buying us less and less, and it's just evaporating like quicksand through our fingers. We talked at the top of the show about some of these social divisions in this country, red versus blue, this polarization. COVID, of course, intensified that. We saw a lot of people moving to Florida. We saw Ron DeSantis championed by some folks and demonized by others. We've seen Florida really stand out as, I guess, taking one side in the culture war. That's not entirely true. I mean, there are obviously very deep blue areas in Florida, the South Florida, Miami. And if we go back to that gubernatorial election between Ron DeSantis and his opponent, well, where you call that was very, very close. So Florida is actually more divided politically, more closely divided than perhaps we think. But nonetheless, we consider the political polarization in this country when we still have a relatively stable economy, all things considered, even with the inflation going on. I mean, the unemployment rate feels pretty low simply because the economy was so hampered during COVID shutdowns that as it comes back, that feels like tremendous growth. Of course, the Biden administration has taken pains to point out that unemployment is in something in the 3%, which is historically quite low. But here's the thing. There's actually fewer jobs in America than there were before COVID. We haven't replaced all the jobs that existed prior to the COVID lockdowns. And it's very simple. A lot of people simply lost their appetite for working. People who were maybe older and closer to retirement but would have liked to work, maybe people who were stay-at-home spouses who would have liked to have that part-time job or that work-from-home job, but it evaporated during COVID and they just haven't replaced it. Younger people who have simply stopped looking, maybe they're spending their whole 20s. Let's not hope they're not piling up student loan debt and getting some master's or PhD until they're 30. There's all kinds of ways. Disabled folks who are receiving disability, who may have nonetheless like to work a little bit, but just stay home and live off of a smaller income. And people who have just been psychologically damaged by COVID and who have sort of fallen off the radar screen. I mean, unemployment counts people who are actively looking. And a lot of people just sort of gave up. And that's, I think, a pretty sad problem for America because we always need to think about economics in human terms. We can't just look at the numbers. We have to think about human beings and what they do and what are their incentives. That's so much more important than looking at things in this aggregate or macro level. But nonetheless, unemployment numbers are a bit misleading when we think of how many people have dropped out and when we understand there are still fewer people working than before COVID. So that's a bit of a headwind, folks. And when we think about inflation, which screws up all kinds of planning for all kinds of businesses. I mean, if you go to restaurants now, some of them, they used to say you had to pay market price for the fish of the day. They would say, you'd see that on the menu, market price. There wasn't a price listed by. Well, some restaurants are now doing that for certain cuts of beef and veal and lamb. That's interesting to me. They're just showing that uncertainty. They don't want to quote a price or keep changing their menu, reprinting their menu every 2 weeks or something like that. So they're just saying, you got to ask your server what that costs. But here's the thing, folks. Talking about low interest rates and talking about the cultural and social ramifications of what low interest rates do to a society. They make us borrow more money. They make us live more for today. They make us not save as much for a rainy day, or more importantly, build capital, both financial and more broadly cultural capital for future generations. I mean, why are we rich? Why is there cheap and abundant energy? Why is there a Starbucks on every corner? Why is the West so amazing from a material perspective? Why does dentistry keep getting better? All these little things which affect our lives in glorious ways. Well, it's because of capital accumulation. It's because previous generations, brought in more profit than they spent, and they saved and invested that, and that build up and build up and build up and build up. And that's cultural and capital accumulation. And now it seems like we're encouraged to do the opposite. We're encouraged to consume more than we make and to borrow and to spend. And if everyone does that on an individual level and that manifests itself throughout society, well, we can see what kind of problems we're going to have. Now, if we look at the U.S. federal government during the worst of the COVID period, during that year of 2020, Donald Trump was president, by the way. Let's not pin this one on Biden. Uncle Sam brought in about $3.5 trillion in taxes from all sources. It spent about $7 trillion. So literally one out of every $2 that Congress spent that year in fiscal 2020 was borrowed. Well, you do that enough times, and we've done it, not that amount, but we've had deficits for years and years and years. That all adds up to $30 trillion in the national debt. But if you look at that debt, the amount of it, it's spread across lots of different yields, lots of different bond amounts, and lots of different interest rates. So you have to weight it. But there's actually a website you can go to, and they average it out and weight it. And they say of that $30 trillion, the overall weighted interest rate, which Uncle Sam, which is us as taxpayers, about what we pay on that's only about 1.6%. Because interest rates, again, have been so low for so long that a lot of Treasury debt has been issued at very low bargain prices. It's not a bargain if you like to get paid interest. And as a result of that, the annual interest payment on the national debt, which Congress has to consider as part of its budget, it's only been about $500 or $600 billion in recent years, even with that enormous $30 trillion number. And again, that's a lot like a Tampa mortgage. If you can get really low interest rates of 3%, your mortgage payment won't be nearly as high as it would be if interest was 17% like back in the 80s. So Uncle Sam has enjoyed a wonderful privilege. Congress has been able to spend lots of money because interest isn't that high. It only costs them $500, $600 billion a year. But if interest was just where it normally has been across history, 5-6%, let's say, all of a sudden, folks, interest on the national debt would be the single biggest line item in the congressional budget, ahead of Social Security and Medicare and defense and all those other things we think the federal government's supposed to provide for us. Imagine that. Imagine if interest rates go up to 5 or 6%, and that's what people demand for Treasury debt. Could happen, folks. All of a sudden, Uncle Sam would be faced with some very tough choices and some cuts in those programs that people rely on, including Social Security and Medicare. This is the Morgan Streetman Show from 10 to 11. I've been your guest host, Jeff Dice. Really enjoyed being with all of you. Hope that wasn't too much cold water to the face on a Monday morning. This is Money Talk, 1010 a.m.
Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.